They say silence is golden, but in 1883, the silence inside the Granite Creek chapel was heavy enough to crush a man's soul. Caleb Blackwood stood at the altar for 3 agonizing hours. The candles burned down to the brass holders. The town whispered. He thought he was losing his dignity, but he was actually about to lose everything he owned. When the church doors finally swung open, the person standing there wasn't the woman he loved. It was a stranger with a loaded pistol in her garter and a secret that would burn their lives to the ground. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the brutal, true account of how a broken heart became the most dangerous weapon in the West. The air inside the First Methodist Church of Granite Creek, Montana, was stagnant, trapped between the thick oak walls and the tin roof that groaned under the midday sun. It was the 14th of June, 1880. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light piercing the stained glass, settling on the brim of the hat Caleb Blackwood held in his white-knuckled hands. Caleb was a man carved from the landscape itself, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of polished saddle leather and a jawline that suggested he didn't smile often. Today, he was supposed to smile. Today, he was supposed to marry Susanna Miller, the daughter of a railway prospector from St. Louis. He checked his pocket watch for the 12th time. The gold casing, warm from his palm, clicked open. 12:45 p.m. The ceremony was scheduled for noon. The pews behind him were filled with the suffocating rustle of restless townsfolk. There was Mrs. Higgins, the baker's wife, fanning herself aggressively with a hymnal, her eyes darting around like a hawk, looking for a field mouse. There was Mayor Whitaker, sweating through his woolen collar, checking his own watch, and exchanging a grimace with Sheriff Beauchamp. "She ain't comin', Caleb," a hushed whisper floated from the back row. It was likely Old Man Guthrie, a ranch hand who had no filter and even fewer teeth. Caleb stiffened but didn't turn. He stared at the crucifix hanging behind the pulpit, his heart hammering a slow, painful rhythm against his ribs. Susanna had been eager. Just last night, she had kissed his cheek outside the livery stables, her perfume smelling of lavender and city rain. "Tomorrow, Caleb," she had said, her blue eyes shimmering. "Tomorrow we start our empire." He had leveraged everything for this. The Blackwood Ranch, over 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, was currently mortgaged to the hilt to pay for the expansion Susanna's father had suggested. A joint venture, they called it. A marriage of hearts and assets. Bir. Onbesh PM. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't just restless now. It was pitying. That was worse than the mockery. Caleb could handle a fight. He could handle a drought. He could handle a stampede. But pity? Pity was a poison that stripped a man of his standing. Reverend Thomas cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet church. "Caleb, son," the Reverend said softly, stepping down from the dais. "Perhaps there has been an accident, or perhaps we should clear the church." "She's coming," Caleb said. His voice was gravel, deep and steady, betraying none of the nausea roiling in his gut. "The wheel on her carriage probably broke. The roads out by the ridge are washed out from the storm." "The roads are dry as a bone, Caleb," the Reverend said gently. At that moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the church creaked. The sound was agonizingly slow. Every head in the congregation turned as one. The rustling stopped. The fanning stopped. Even the dust seemed to hang suspended in the air. Caleb turned, his heart leaping into his throat. He expected to see white lace. He expected to see Susanna, flushed and apologetic, perhaps with a torn hem or a broken heel. He did not see Susanna. Standing in the doorway, framed by the blinding white light of the Montana afternoon, was a woman. But she wasn't wearing white. She was wearing a dusty, travel-worn dress of faded calico blue. A large, battered carpet bag sat at her feet. She looked exhausted, her hair the color of dark chestnuts escaping from a loose braid. She wasn't Susanna. Caleb had never seen this woman in his life. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior, scanning the sea of confused faces until they locked onto Caleb. There was no fear in her gaze, only a grim determination that chilled him more than the summer heat should allow. She picked up her bag, walked down the center aisle past the gawking townspeople, her boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. She didn't stop until she was 3 feet from Caleb. The smell of horse sweat and stale tobacco clung to her clothes, cutting through the scent of beeswax candles. "Are you Caleb Blackwood?" she asked. Her voice was parched, raspy. "I am," Caleb said, his brow furrowing. "Who are you? Where is Susanna?" The woman let out a short, humorless laugh. She reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, slapping it into Caleb's chest. "Susanna Miller is halfway to the Dakota Territory by now. Sugar," the woman said, loud enough for the back row to hear. "And she took the bank draft you gave her father with her." The church erupted. Chaos. Absolute chaos. Mrs. Higgins actually fainted, or at least performed a very convincing pantomime of it. Mayor Whitaker stood up, shouting for order. Sheriff Beauchamp began pushing his way down the aisle. Caleb didn't hear any of it. The world had narrowed down to the piece of paper in his hands. He unfolded it. It wasn't a letter from Susanna. It was a bill of sale, a transfer of funds from the Granite Creek Bank to a bearer bond account in Street. Louis. Authorized by Caleb Blackwood. "I didn't sign this," Caleb whispered, his blood turning to ice. "She practiced your signature for 3 weeks," the strange woman said. She looked around, spotting the pitcher of communion water on the small table. Without asking, she poured herself a glass and downed it. I watched her do it. Caleb grabbed the woman's arm. His grip was iron. "Who are you? Did you help her?" The woman winced but didn't pull away. She looked up at him, and for the first time, Caleb saw the desperation hiding behind her bravado. Her eyes were a striking hazel, flecked with green, but they were rimmed with red fatigue. "Name's Abigail. Abigail Fletcher," she said. "And if I helped her, I wouldn't be standing here telling you you're a fool. I'd be on the train with her splitting your money." Sheriff Beauchamp arrived at the altar, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt revolver. "What's the meaning of this? Young woman, you're disturbing the peace." "A crime's been committed, Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice rising, cracking with the fury that was finally breaking through the shock. "She says Susanna stole the expansion funds. That was $20,000. A collective gasp went through the room. $20,000 in 1883 was a fortune. It was enough to buy half the county. "I can catch her," Caleb said, turning to run toward the door. "If she left this morning, the train hasn't reached the junction yet." "She didn't leave this morning," Abigail said calmly. "She left 2 days ago. You just didn't notice she was gone because she told you she was preparing and couldn't be seen." Caleb stopped dead. It was true. He hadn't seen Susanna since Tuesday. "Why are you here?" Caleb asked, turning back to Abigail. "Why tell me?" Abigail looked at the sheriff, then at the mayor, and finally back to Caleb. She lowered her voice. "Because she stole from me, too, and I have nowhere else to go. I need a job, Mr. Blackwood, and I figure since my former traveling companion just bankrupted you, you might need someone who knows how to spot a grifter." "I don't need a maid," Caleb spat. "I'm not a maid," Abigail retorted, her chin tilting up. "I can ride, I can shoot, and I can keep books better than whoever let that woman walk out with your fortune. And right now, judging by the way that Vulture over there is looking at you," she nodded toward the side entrance. Caleb looked. Standing in the shadows was Thaddeus Sterling. Thaddeus was the wealthiest man in the territory, a land baron who had been trying to buy the Blackwood water rights for a decade. He was leaning against a pillar, a smug, predatory smile plastered on his face. He didn't look surprised. In fact, he looked delighted. He knew, Caleb realized. Sterling knew. "He didn't just know," Abigail whispered. "He paid for her ticket." Caleb felt the room spin. This wasn't just a heartbreak. It was a corporate assassination. Susanna wasn't just a thief. She was a weapon aimed at the Blackwood legacy. "Reverend," Caleb said, his voice hollow, "send everyone home. There will be no wedding." He walked past Abigail without looking at her, marching down the aisle toward the blinding light of the door. But as he passed the pews, he heard the whispers change. They weren't pitying anymore. They were laughing. He stepped out onto the wooden porch, the heat hitting him like a physical blow. He stared at the dusty street, at the saloon across the way, at the bank that now held his debt but not his money. Abigail Fletcher followed him out. She stood next to him, watching the townspeople file out, chattering like magpies. "You're in trouble," she said. "Get off my property," Caleb warned. "This is a church. It's God's property," she countered. "And you need to listen. Sterling is going to call in your loan tomorrow. He thinks you're broken. He thinks you're going to drink yourself into a stupor tonight and sign over the deed in the morning." Caleb looked at her. "And how do you know so much about Thaddeus Sterling?" Abigail hesitated. She looked down at her worn boots. "Because before I fell in with Susanna, I worked for him. I was his bookkeeper, until I found out what he does to people who get in his way." She looked up, her gaze piercing. "I can help you save your ranch, Caleb. But we have to make a deal." The sun was setting over the Blackwood ranch, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the valley. The ranch house was a sprawling structure of timber and stone, built by Caleb's grandfather, Samuel Blackwood, 50 years ago. It felt empty tonight. Caleb sat at his heavy oak desk, a bottle of whiskey open but untouched. He was staring at the ledger. It was worse than he thought. The loan he had taken to combine with Susanna's dowry was due in full upon the event of the marriage, or within 30 days if the marriage didn't occur. But without Susanna's capital, he couldn't service the debt. Sterling would foreclose. He would take the land, the cattle, the house. A knock on the doorframe made him look up. Abigail was standing there. She had seemingly walked the 5 miles from town. Her dress was dustier, and she looked ready to collapse, but she was still standing. "I told you to get lost," Caleb growled. "And I told you I have a proposition," she said, walking into the room and sitting in the leather chair opposite him without an invitation. "You need a wife." Caleb laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "I think I've had enough of women for one lifetime, Miss Fletcher." "Not for love," she said impatiently. "For the contract. I read the loan agreement at the bank. Sterling keeps a copy in his office. There's a clause. Clause 4, Section B. If the borrower is married and produces proof of spousal assets combined with the ranch output, the loan term can be extended by 2 years to allow for household stabilization." Caleb narrowed his eyes. He knew the clause. He had ignored it because he thought he'd be swimming in Susanna's money. "I don't have spousal assets. You look like you don't have 2 nickels to rub together." "I don't have money," Abigail admitted. "But I have a deed, a mining claim in Nevada. It's technically worthless right now because the mine flooded. But on paper, it's an asset. It's valued at $5,000. Caleb sat up straighter. "Why would you do this? Why help me?" Abigail's face hardened. She looked toward the window, toward the darkness where the town of Granite Creek lay. "Because Thaddeus Sterling is a monster. He didn't just fire me, Caleb. He ruined my family. My father was the previous owner of the Granite Creek Mercantile. Sterling drove him to suicide to buy the building for pennies." She turned back to him, her eyes burning with a cold fire. "I want to see him lose. I want to see the look on his face when he realizes he didn't win today. I want revenge. And you want to keep your land. So," Caleb said slowly, "you're proposing a marriage of convenience. Strictly business," Abigail said. "I marry you. We present the mining deed to the bank tomorrow. You get your 2-year extension. In exchange, you give me room and board. And when the ranch turns a profit, you give me $500 so I can move to California and start over. And until then, I work. I cook. I clean. I handle the books. I earn my keep." Caleb looked at her. She was a stranger. She was rough around the edges. She had associated with the woman who destroyed him, but she had a fire in her that Susanna never had. Susanna was soft, perfumed lies. Abigail was hard truths and dust. "People will talk," Caleb said. "They'll say I'm crazy. Marrying a drifter the day after my fiancé ran off. Let them talk," Abigail said. Better they call you crazy than call you homeless. Caleb stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at his land. The land his father died working. He couldn't lose it. Not to Sterling. He turned back to Abigail. "Get in the wagon." "Where are we going?" she asked, blinking. "Judge Penthalo lives 3 miles east. He owes me a favor. If we're going to do this, we're doing it tonight. Before Sterling opens the bank in the morning." Abigail stood up, her legs trembling slightly. For the first time, the mask slipped, and he saw fear. She was binding herself to a strange man, a big, angry cowboy, in the middle of nowhere. "Strictly business," she repeated, her voice shaking. Caleb grabbed his hat. Strictly business. They rode out into the night under a blanket of stars. The silence between them wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't empty like the church had been. It was charged with the electricity of a storm about to break. When they arrived at Judge Penthalo's cabin, the old man was in his nightshirt, holding a lantern. "Caleb?" The judge squinted. "Is this Susanna?" "No," Caleb said, stepping into the light, pulling Abigail with him. "This is Abigail, and we need to be married. Now." The ceremony took 5 minutes in the judge's parlor. No flowers, no music, no white dress. Just the scratch of a pen on a license and the exchange of a simple copper ring. Caleb had in his saddlebag a ring he used for cattle tagging, hammered round. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the judge mumbled, looking confused. Caleb didn't kiss her. He simply shook her hand. "Deal's sealed," he said. Abigail nodded, her hand small and rough in his. "Deal sealed." As they walked back to the wagon, a rider appeared on the ridge. He watched them for a moment, then turned his horse and galloped toward town. "Sterling's spy," Abigail noted, watching the dust settle. "Let him run," Caleb said, climbing onto the bench seat. "Tomorrow, we go to war." But as they rode back to the ranch, the reality set in. Caleb was married to a stranger who slept in the guest room that night, locking the door with a loud click that echoed through the silent house. Caleb lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He had saved the ranch for now. But he had invited a wildfire into his home, and he had a nagging suspicion that Abigail Fletcher was hiding something far more dangerous than a worthless mining deed. The next morning, the trouble started before breakfast. The morning sun hit the Granite Creek Valley with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Inside the Blackwood ranch house, the air was thick with the smell of burnt bacon and awkward silence. Caleb Blackwood sat at the head of the long pine table, staring at the blackened strip of meat on his plate. Across from him, Abigail, his wife of less than 12 hours, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her chin held high, daring him to comment on the culinary disaster. "The stove draws to the left," Caleb grumbled, picking up his fork. "You have to rotate the pan." "Good to know," Abigail replied, her voice cool. "I was an accountant, Mr. Blackwood, not a short-order cook. If you wanted biscuits and gravy, you should have hired a cook. You married a business partner." Caleb chewed the charcoal bacon. It tasted like ash and regret. "We're going to town," he said, pushing the plate away. "Bank opens in an hour. Wear something respectful." Abigail looked down at her calico dress, the only one she owned. "This is what I have." Caleb sighed, stood up, and walked to the hallway closet. He rummaged through a box Susanna had left behind, mostly linens and curtains, and pulled out a dark green riding shawl. He tossed it to her. "Cover the dust. Let's go." The ride into Granite Creek was a gauntlet. As their wagon rolled down Main Street, heads turned. Shopkeepers swept their porches with exaggerated slowness, eyes glued to the couple. The scandal of the jilted groom marrying the stranger in the same 24 hours had spread faster than a prairie fire. They pulled up in front of the Granite Creek bank. Thaddeus Sterling's horse, a massive black stallion with silver-plated tack, was already hitched outside. "Ready?" Caleb asked, offering his hand to help her down. Abigail ignored the hand and hopped down herself. Inside, the bank was cool and smelled of ink and old paper. The teller, a young man named Perkins who usually greeted Caleb with a smile, turned pale and scurried into the back office. Moments later, The heavy mahogany door swung open, and Thaddeus Sterling emerged. Sterling was a man who wore his wealth like armor. His suit was tailored silk, his watch chain was heavy gold, and his smile was a practiced weapon. "Caleb!" Sterling boomed, his voice echoing off the marble floors. "I was just preparing the foreclosure papers. Sad business. Truly sad, but the contract was clear." "The contract," Caleb interrupted, his voice steady, "stated that the loan term would be extended if I was married." Sterling's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Yes, well, seeing as Miss Miller is currently enjoying the hospitality of the westbound train, this is my wife," Caleb said, stepping aside to reveal Abigail. "Mrs. Abigail Blackwood." Sterling froze. His eyes shifted to Abigail, and the jovial mask dropped completely. For a moment, there was just raw, cold hatred. "Abigail," Sterling hissed, "I should have known you'd crawl out of the woodwork." "Hello, Thaddeus," Abigail said, her voice surprisingly strong. She reached into her reticule and pulled out the folded mining deed and the marriage license Judge Penthalo had signed the night before. She slammed them onto the counter. "Clause 4, Section B, spousal assets. The Silver Queen Mine in Nevada. Assessed value, $5,000. Combined with the Blackwood herd, we meet the collateral requirements for the extension." Sterling snatched the papers. He scanned them, his face turning a blotchy red. "This mine is a hole in the ground. It's flooded, but the deed is valid," Abigail countered. "And the assessment is from the Nevada Bureau of Land Management, dated 6 months ago. Legally, it's an asset. Unless you want to argue with the federal government in court, that would tie up the foreclosure for at least a year, maybe 2. Sterling looked from the paper to Caleb, then to Abigail. He knew he was beaten, not permanently, but for today. He threw the papers back on the counter. "Fine," Sterling spat. 2 years. But hear me, Blackwood. You're delaying the inevitable. The drought is coming, beef prices are dropping, and you," he pointed a manicured finger at Abigail, "you are playing a dangerous game, girl. You think you can hide behind him?" "I'm not hiding," Abigail said. "We'll see," Sterling sneered. He leaned in close to Caleb. "Enjoy your honeymoon. I'll be watching." Sterling stormed back into his office, slamming the door so hard the glass pane rattled. Caleb let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked at Abigail. She was trembling again, her hands gripping the counter edge until her knuckles were white. "You did good," Caleb said softly. Abigail looked up at him, her eyes wide. "He's going to kill us, Caleb. He's not going to wait 2 years. Let's get home," Caleb said, placing a hand on the small of her back to guide her out. It was the first time he had touched her with anything resembling gentleness. The victory at the bank bought them time, but it didn't buy them peace. Over the next 2 weeks, the ranch became a battleground of awkward domesticity. Abigail took over the ranch office, organizing Caleb's chaotic piles of receipts and ledgers. She found errors, lots of them. Suppliers overcharging, hands padding their hours. She saved him $50 in the first week alone, but the evenings were hard. They ate in silence. Caleb slept in the main bedroom. Abigail took the guest room. The door remained locked. One evening, a storm rolled in. Thunder shook the foundations of the house. Caleb was in the barn, checking on a mare about to foal, when Abigail appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her shawl. "Need help?" she shouted over the wind. "Go back inside," Caleb yelled. "It's dirty work." She didn't listen. She rolled up her sleeves and knelt in the straw beside him. For 3 hours, they worked together to help the struggling mare. Abigail didn't flinch at the blood or the fluids. She was calm, soothing the horse while Caleb pulled. When the foal finally slid out, wet and blinking, Caleb sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at Abigail. She had straw in her hair and dirt on her cheek, but she was smiling. It was a genuine smile, the first one he'd seen. "It's a colt," she whispered. "He's strong," Caleb said. He looked at her. Really looked at her. "You've done this before? My uncle had a farm in Kentucky. she said. Before everything went wrong. What went wrong, Abigail? Caleb asked. The adrenaline of the birth had stripped away some of his defenses. Why does Sterling hate you so much? It's more than just you being a bookkeeper. Abigail's smile faded. She stood up, brushing off her dress. He hates me because I know where the bodies are buried, Caleb, and because I refuse to help him bury one more. She turned to leave the barn, but stopped at the door. And because Susanna didn't just leave you for the money. Sterling blackmailed her. He found out about a debt her father owed in St. Louis. He told her if she didn't leave you at the altar, he'd have her father arrested. She took the money to pay off Sterling's associates. Caleb stood up slowly. You're saying she didn't want to go? I'm saying she was weak, Abigail said, her voice hard. She chose her father over you. But Sterling, he orchestrated the whole thing to break you. He wanted you broken so you'd sell. She walked out into the rain, leaving Caleb alone with the newborn foal and the shattering realization that his heartbreak had been manufactured by the man who held his mortgage. August arrived, bringing with it a heat that blistered the paint on the siding and turned the soil into concrete. The creek, the lifeblood of the Blackwood ranch, began to recede. Caleb was out on the range from dawn until dusk, moving the herd of 500 head to the upper pastures where the grass was still somewhat green. Abigail had taken to riding out with him sometimes, bringing lunch and water. She wasn't a natural rider, she bounced too much in the saddle, but she didn't complain. On a Tuesday afternoon, the trouble started. Caleb was checking the fence line near the northern ridge when he saw it. The creek, which should have been a steady flow this time of year, was a trickle. That's not right, he muttered. He spurred his horse, a roan gelding named Rusty, and rode upstream. Abigail, who had been checking a separate section of fence, saw him bolt and gallop to catch up. What is it? She yelled over the hoofbeats. Water's gone, Caleb shouted back. Someone dammed it upstream. They rode for 3 miles, crossing onto public land that bordered the Sterling estate. There, in a narrow gorge known as Devil's Throat, they found it. A massive pile of rocks and felled timber blocked the creek, diverting the water into a sluice that ran toward Sterling's land. Standing guard by the dam were 3 men. Caleb recognized them immediately. The brute in the center was Silas Vane, Sterling's foreman, a man known for using his fists more than his brain. Caleb pulled his Winchester rifle from its scabbard. Stay back, Abigail. Like hell, she said, pulling a small, pearl-handled revolver from her skirt pocket. Caleb blinked at it but didn't have time to argue. Vane, Caleb shouted, riding closer. Tear it down. That's illegal diversion of a waterway. Silas Vane spat on the ground and rested his hand on his holster. Mister, Sterling says this here is an irrigation project. Says if you got a problem, you can file a complaint at the courthouse. Judge is out of town for a month. Though, the men laughed. I'm not filing a complaint, Caleb said, cocking the rifle. I'm clearing the obstruction. You touch those rocks, Blackwood, and you're trespassing, Vane warned. Caleb didn't hesitate. He raised the rifle and fired a warning shot into the dirt at Vane's feet. The horse Vane was holding reared, and chaos erupted. Vane drew his gun. Kill him! Gunfire cracked through the gorge. A bullet whizzed past Caleb's ear, sounding like an angry hornet. He returned fire, hitting one of the hired hands in the shoulder. The man spun and fell. Abigail screamed as her horse panicked, bucking wildly. She managed to stay on, aiming her small revolver. She fired, once, twice. She didn't hit anyone, but the noise spooked the third man's horse, sending him crashing into the timber dam. Get to the rocks, Caleb yelled at her. He dismounted, slapping Rusty on the rump to send him away from the fire. He grabbed Abigail off her horse and dragged her behind a cluster of boulders just as a bullet chipped the stone inches from his face. Are you hit? He asked, checking her. No. Are you? Her eyes were wide, adrenaline dilating her pupils. I'm fine. Caleb peered over the rock. Vane was pinned down behind a log, but he had a clear line of sight. They were stuck. We can't stay here, Caleb said. They'll flank us. The dynamite, Abigail said, pointing to a wooden crate near the dam. The men had been using it to blow rocks for the diversion. "If we can hit that crate, it's 50 yards away," Caleb said. "With a pistol? Impossible. Not for me," Abigail said. She took a deep breath, steadying her hand on the rock. "My father, before the store, he was a marksman in the war. He taught me." Caleb looked at her. The scared city girl was gone. In her place was a woman with ice in her veins. "Cover me," she said. Caleb popped up and fired 3 rapid shots, forcing Vane to duck. Abigail stood up. She didn't rush. She extended her arm, closed one eye, and exhaled. Bang! For a second, nothing happened. Then, the crate erupted. The explosion was deafening. It blew the timber dam apart in a shower of splinters and water. The backed-up creek roared free, a wall of water surging down the gorge, washing away the debris and forcing Vane and his men to scramble up the ravine to avoid drowning. "Let's go!" Caleb grabbed Abigail's hand, and they ran for their horses, which had circled back. They rode hard, not stopping until they were back on Blackwood land. The water was already flowing again in the creek bed, muddy and turbulent, but flowing. They dismounted near the barn, both of them breathing hard, covered in dust and sweat. Caleb looked at the water, then at Abigail. He started to laugh. It was a jagged, hysterical sound of relief. "You blew it up," he said, shaking his head. "You actually blew it up." Abigail was shaking now, the adrenaline crash hitting her. She leaned against the corral fence, sliding down until she was sitting in the dirt. "I've never shot at a person before." Caleb knelt beside her. He reached out and, for the first time, cupped her face in his hands. "You saved the herd, Abigail. You saved us." He looked at her lips. The distance between them, usually miles wide, had vanished. He leaned in, and she didn't pull away. He kissed her, fierce and desperate, tasting of dust and gunpowder. She kissed him back, her hands gripping the front of his shirt. For a moment, the war with Sterling didn't exist. There was only the heat of the afternoon and the woman who had just fought a war for him. He pulled back, resting his forehead against hers. "Who are you, really?" he whispered. "I told you," she said softly. "I'm your wife, Mr. Blackwood." The shout came from the front gate. Caleb stood up immediately, his hand going to his gun. But it wasn't Sterling's men. It was Sheriff Beauchamp, and he wasn't alone. 2 men in long dusters, wearing badges that weren't local, sat on horses beside him. U.S. Marshals. Caleb's stomach dropped. He looked down at Abigail. Her face had gone ashen white. The color had drained from her so completely she looked like a ghost. "Stay here," Caleb ordered. He walked to the gate. "Sheriff." "What can I do for you?" "Sorry to intrude, Caleb," the sheriff said, looking uncomfortable. "These gentlemen are looking for someone." A woman, one of the marshals, stepped forward. He held up a wanted poster. The sketch was crude, but the eyes were unmistakable. "We're looking for a Mary Beth Calloway," the marshal said. "Wanted in Chicago for embezzlement and the attempted murder of a railroad tycoon. We have a tip she's been using the alias Abigail Fletcher." Caleb froze. He looked back at the barn. Abigail was standing up, brushing the dirt off her dress. She didn't run. She just stood there, watching him. "She's my wife," Caleb said, his voice low. "Doesn't matter who she married." "Son," the marshal said, resting his hand on his saddle horn. "If she's Mary Beth Calloway, she's coming with us. The bounty is $2,000. Caleb looked at the poster, then back at Abigail. The woman who had just saved his life. The woman who had blown up a dam to save his cattle. The woman he had just kissed. "She's not who you think she is," Caleb lied. "We'll be the judge of that," the marshal said, dismounting. "Ma'am, step forward." Abigail walked toward them. She stopped next to Caleb. She didn't look at the marshals. She looked at Caleb. "I didn't try to kill him," she whispered to Caleb, tears welling in her eyes. "He was hurting me. I hit him with the ledger. I didn't know he fell out the window." Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the secret. Not a flooded mine. She was a fugitive. "Gentlemen," Caleb said, stepping in front of her, "you're making a mistake. This is Abigail Blackwood, and she hasn't left this county in 3 years. You willing to swear to that in court, Cowboy?" the marshal asked, narrowing his eyes. "Because aiding a fugitive is a federal offense. I'm willing to die for it," Caleb said, his hand hovering over his gun. The standoff in the dusty yard was silent, save for the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods. 3 guns against 1. Then, a voice called out from the road, "He's telling the truth." Everyone turned. A buggy was coming up the drive, and sitting in it, looking pale and travel-worn, was a woman in a pristine white dress. It was Susanna Miller. The arrival of Susanna Miller was like a thunderclap in a library. The silence that followed was so profound you could hear the wind rustling, the dry corn stalks in the field a mile away. Susanna didn't look like the pristine, porcelain doll Caleb remembered. Her white dress was stained with mud at the hem, her blonde curls were matted against her forehead, and her face was gaunt, stripped of the vanity that had defined her. She looked like a woman who had seen the devil and barely escaped. She climbed down from the buggy, her legs shaking, and walked straight toward the marshals, ignoring Caleb completely. "You're looking for Mary Beth Calloway," Susanna said, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry. "And you have the wrong woman. The lead marshal, a grizzled man named distinctively Red, owing to his beard, lowered his gun slightly but didn't holster it. And who might you be, miss?" "I am Susanna Miller," she declared, reaching into her bodice to pull out a thick, leather-bound ledger. She held it up like a shield. "And this is the proof you need. Abigail didn't attack a tycoon in Chicago. She defended herself against Thaddeus Sterling's business partner, a man who tried to force himself on her when she discovered he was cooking the books for the Union Pacific Railroad." Caleb watched, stunned. He looked at Abigail. Tears were streaming down her dusty face, cutting clean tracks through the grime. She was looking at Susanna not with anger, but with disbelief. "You have the ledger?" Abigail whispered. "I thought Sterling burned it." "He tried," Susanna said, turning to look at Abigail for the first time. "He kept it in his safe as insurance. When I went to collect my payment for leaving Caleb, I saw it. I took it instead of the cash." Caleb stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Susanna, what is going on?" Susanna finally looked at him. The shame in her eyes was palpable. She flinched, as if expecting him to strike her. "I'm sorry, Caleb. I was weak. Sterling, he owned my father's debt. He told me if I didn't leave you, he'd put my father in debtor's prison and burn your ranch to the ground anyway. He offered me $10,000 to run. But when I got to the station, he never sent the money. He sent a man to kill me." A collective gasp went through the group. Even the sheriff looked shocked. "I got away," Susanna continued, her voice breaking. "I hid in the old mines for 3 days, and I realized I had destroyed the only good man I ever knew for a monster who wanted us both dead." She turned back to the marshal. "This ledger proves that Sterling and his partners have been defrauding the government for years. Abigail Mary Beth was the accountant who found out. They framed her to discredit her testimony. If you arrest her, you're arresting the only witness who can decode these pages." The marshal looked at the ledger, then at Abigail, and finally at the wanted poster. He slowly crumpled the poster and shoved it into his pocket. "Fraud against the Union Pacific is a federal crime," the marshal grunted. He took the ledger from Susanna. "If this book says what you say it does, Sterling is the one we want. But until we verify this, nobody leaves the county. You understand?" "We aren't going anywhere," Caleb said, his arm moving instinctively around Abigail's waist. "Sheriff," the marshal barked, "ride with us to Sterling's estate. We have some questions for the land baron." The lawmen mounted up and tore out of the yard, dust billowing in their wake. Caleb, Abigail, and Susanna were left standing in the yard. The tension was thick enough to choke on. "You came back," Abigail said softly. "I had nowhere else to go," Susanna admitted. She looked at Caleb, her eyes pleading. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Caleb. I couldn't let him win. Not after what he did to me. Caleb looked at the woman he had intended to marry. She was beautiful, yes, but she was a stranger to him now. Then he looked at Abigail, fierce, loyal, covered in dirt. The woman who had blown up a dam to save his livelihood. "You can stay in the guest room," Caleb said to Susanna, his voice flat. "But only until the marshals are done. Then you go." Susanna nodded, tears spilling over. "Thank you, Caleb. That's more than I deserve." As Susanna walked into the house, Abigail turned to Caleb. She looked vulnerable, small. "You know who I am now. Mary Beth Calloway, a fugitive. I know who you are," Caleb said, pulling her close, not caring about the neighbors or the hands watching. "You're Abigail Blackwood. You're the woman who rides into fire for me. I don't care what name you were born with. I care about the name you carry now." He kissed her forehead, lingering there. "But this isn't over. Sterling knows the marshals are coming. He won't go quietly." Caleb was right. Thaddeus Sterling was not a man to surrender to a badge. He was a man who believed he owned the law, and when the sun began to set that evening, the sky turned a blood red that promised violence. They spent the next few hours turning the ranch house into a fortress. Caleb boarded up the windows. Abigail loaded every gun in the cabinet. Even Susanna helped, tearing up her petticoats to make bandages and filling buckets with water in case of fire. "He'll come at night," Caleb said, peering through a crack in the shutters. "He knows the marshals will need a warrant from the judge in the next county to enter his main house. That buys him 12 hours. He'll use them to wipe out the witnesses." "Us," Abigail said, checking the cylinder of the Colt Peacemaker Caleb had given her. "Us," Caleb agreed. At midnight, the moon was obscured by heavy clouds. The darkness was absolute. The only sound was the wind howling through the eaves of the old house. Then, the first torch was thrown. It landed on the porch roof, sputtering and hissing. "Fire!" Susanna screamed from the kitchen. "Get the buckets!" Caleb yelled. He kicked open the front door, rifle in hand. 3 riders were circling the house, torches in hand. More were coming up the drive. Sterling had emptied the saloons, hiring every mercenary and drifter with a gun. "Burn it out!" a voice roared from the dark. It was Silas Vane. "Sterling says no survivors." Caleb raised his Winchester and fired. A rider dropped from his saddle. The yard erupted into a storm of gunfire. Bullets chewed into the wood siding of the house, shattering glass and sending splinters flying. Abigail was at the window in the parlor, firing steadily. She wasn't just shooting wildly. She was placing her shots. She hit a man trying to climb the trellis, sending him crashing down into the rose bushes. "They're flanking us," she shouted. "They're going for the back door." "Susanna, watch the kitchen," Caleb ordered. "I can't shoot," Susanna cried, huddled under the table. "Then throw the damn water," Caleb roared. He ran to the back of the house just as the door was kicked in. 2 men surged into the hallway. Caleb didn't hesitate. He swung the butt of his rifle, cracking the first man across the jaw. The second man tackled him, driving him into the wall. They grappled on the floor, knocking over a grandfather clock that chimed wildly as it fell. The man's hands were around Caleb's throat, squeezing the life out of him. Caleb's vision began to spot. He reached for his belt knife, but his arm was pinned. Bang! The man on top of him went limp. Caleb shoved the body off and gasped for air. Susanna was standing there, holding a smoking shotgun, her eyes wide with horror. She had pulled the trigger. "I didn't want to," she stammered. "You did good," Caleb rasped, getting to his feet. "Reload." The battle raged for an hour. The house was riddled with holes, smoke filling the hallways. They were running low on ammunition. "There's too many of them," Abigail said, crouching beside Caleb near the front window. Her face was smudged with soot, and her sleeve was torn where a bullet had grazed her arm. "We have to get to the barn," Caleb said. "We have the dynamite left over from the dam." "That's suicide," Abigail said. "Crossing the yard? Staying here is suicide," Caleb countered. "The roof is catching. We burn or we fight." He looked at her. In the chaos, amidst the smoke and blood, he saw the woman he loved. Not a contract. Not a partner. His wife. "I love you, Abigail," he said. She froze. "You picked a hell of a time to tell me, cowboy. Better late than never." He grinned. A feral, dangerous grin. On three, on three. Caleb kicked the door open. "Cover us," he yelled to Susanna. They sprinted into the yard. Bullets kicked up dirt around their heels. Caleb fired his revolvers blindly to suppress the shooters, while Abigail ran for the barn door. They made it inside, barring the heavy doors behind them. But they weren't alone. Standing in the shadows of the barn, holding a lantern in one hand and a heavy pistol in the other, was Thaddeus Sterling. "I knew you'd come here," Sterling said, his voice smooth, contrasting with the madness in his eyes. "Rats always run to the dark." He threw the lantern into the hayloft. The dry straw caught instantly. The barn, filled with winter feed, began to blaze. "It's over, Thaddeus," Abigail shouted, aiming her empty gun at him. She pulled the trigger. Click. "Empty," Sterling laughed. "It's over when I have the deed. The ledger. And your corpses." He raised his pistol, aiming squarely at Caleb's chest. "Drop the gun, Blackwood," Sterling ordered. Caleb dropped his empty rifles. He stood with his hands raised, stepping in front of Abigail. "Let her go," Caleb said. "You want the land? Take it. You want the water? It's yours. Just let her walk away." "Noble," Sterling sneered. "But stupid. She's the loose end, Caleb. She's the one who knows the numbers." The fire roared above them, the heat becoming unbearable. Flaming debris began to fall from the rafters. "You're not a businessman, Thaddeus," Abigail said, her voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "You're just a thief in a silk suit." Sterling's face twisted in rage. "I built this valley." He cocked the hammer. At that moment, a shadow moved in the hayloft above where the fire was raging hottest. It was Susanna. She had followed them, sneaking in through the side hatch. She held a pitchfork. With a scream of pure, terrified rage, Susanna leaped from the burning loft. She didn't land on Sterling, but she landed on the stall door next to him, the impact sending sparks and burning hay showering over him. Startled, Sterling spun around, firing his gun wildly. The bullet hit Caleb in the shoulder, spinning him around. "Caleb!" Abigail screamed. Sterling turned back to finish him, but Caleb was already moving. Ignoring the pain in his shoulder, Caleb charged. He tackled Sterling, driving him back into the burning support beam. They wrestled for the gun. Sterling was older, but he was desperate and surprisingly strong. He kneed Caleb in the gut, forcing him back. Sterling raised the gun again. Abigail grabbed a heavy branding iron from the forge nearby. She swung it with both hands, channeling every ounce of rage, every year of fear, every injustice she had suffered. The iron connected with Sterling's wrist with a sickening crunch. He screamed, dropping the gun. Caleb scooped up the pistol. He stood up, aiming it at Sterling, who was clutching his broken wrist, backing away toward the open barn doors. "Get out," Caleb said, his voice like death. "You won't shoot me," Sterling panted, sweating, eyes darting. "I'm Thaddeus Sterling. I own the judge. I own the—" "You don't own me," Caleb said. Before Caleb could pull the trigger, the sound of galloping horses filled the yard. Dozens of them. "Federal marshals, drop your weapons." Red and his men had returned, and they had brought the cavalry, literally. 20 men surrounded the burning barn. Sterling looked at the marshals, then at Caleb. He realized there was no way out. The arrogance finally drained from his face, replaced by the hollow look of a man who had lost everything. He fell to his knees in the dirt. Caleb lowered the gun. He didn't need to kill him. Watching Thaddeus Sterling be shackled and dragged away in front of the town he tried to enslave was a far better punishment. The sun rose on a blackened, scarred ranch, but it was still standing. The fire had taken the barn, but the house remained. 3 days later, the smoke had cleared. Sterling was in a federal holding cell, awaiting transport to Chicago to face charges of fraud, arson, and attempted murder. The ledger Susanna provided was the nail in his coffin. Susanna stood by her buggy, ready to leave. She looked different now. She wore a simple traveling dress, no jewelry. "Where will you go?" Abigail asked. They stood on the porch, the awkwardness between them replaced by a strange, battle-forged respect. "Street Lewis," Susanna said. "I have an aunt there. I need to work. For the first time in my life." She looked at Caleb. "I'm leaving the bank draft. The 20,000. It's in the kitchen. Consider it payment for the barn." "You don't have to do that," Caleb said. "Yes, I do," Susanna said. She climbed into the buggy. "Be happy, Caleb. You found the right one." She flicked the reins and drove off, not looking back. Caleb turned to Abigail. Her arm was bandaged, and she looked exhausted, but her eyes were bright. "So," Caleb said, leaning against the porch rail, "the marshals cleared you. Self-defense." "They did," she nodded. "I'm a free woman. No more Mary Beth. Just Abigail." "And the contract?" Caleb asked. "Sterling is gone. The ranch is safe. The debt is paid. According to our deal, you get $500 and a ticket to California." Abigail looked down at her boots. The silence stretched. Heavy and terrifying. "Is that what you want?" Caleb asked softly. "California?" Abigail looked up at him. She looked at the charred remains of the barn, then at the horizon where the sun was hitting the mountains, painting them gold. "I hear California is crowded," she said, "and I've grown fond of this porch." Caleb stepped closer. He took her hand, the hand that had signed the marriage license, the hand that had blown up a dam, the hand that had saved his life. "I don't want a business partner, Abigail," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want a wife. I want you." Abigail smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing Caleb had ever seen. "Well, Mr. Blackwood," she said, stepping into his arms, "I suppose we should negotiate a new contract. Clause 1. You do the cooking on Sundays." Caleb laughed, pulling her in for a kiss that tasted of hope and fresh starts. "Deal." They stood there as the morning sun warmed the valley, two broken people who had found their pieces in each other. The cowboy who waited at the altar alone had lost a bride but found a destiny. And as for Abigail, she finally stopped running. She was home. And so, the legend of the Blackwood Ranch wasn't written in ink, but in gunpowder and grit. Caleb and Abigail didn't just save a piece of land. They saved each other. Their story reminds us that sometimes, the worst day of your life is just clearing the path for the best days to come. Fate has a funny way of breaking our plans to give us what we actually need. If this story of betrayal, justice, and undying love moved you, please give this video a like. It helps us share these lost legends with more people. Share this with someone who believes in second chances, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon. We have plenty more true tales of the Wild West waiting for you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next trail.